How many do we have online?
We got, we have like 10.
Very good. How's everyone doing? Yeah, no worries. One more minute.
Well, you've got a very obedient set of students. Mine don't just stop talking.
Did you have trouble finding Renaissance? No.
Oh, not yet.
All right, let's start. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Claire, for organizing the event, and Grace for assisting. There will be lunch packaged arriving in about half an hour. So at the end of the talk, you can go help yourself to that. Sandwiches and cookies and drinks. So it's a really great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Alex Gourevitch today. Professor Gourevitch is an associate professor of political science at Brown University. He earned a BA in social studies from Harvard, an MPhil and a PhD from Columbia University in political science. He's a native of California originally, and a fellow sufferer under New England's harsh winters and late springs and short springs. And then, anyway. So before joining the faculty at Brown, Professor Gourevitch taught at McMaster University. He was also a postdoc at Brown and at Harvard. His first book, From Slavery to the Cooperative Commonwealth, Labor and Republican Liberty in the 19th Century, was published in 2015 at Cambridge University Press. He's the author of numerous articles on the history of political and economic thought, republicanism, Marxism, liberalism, and democratic theory. He's especially interested in freedom, work and leisure, civil disobedience, resistance, and strikes. He's also a regular political commentator for publications like Jacobin, Dissent, and Salon. I'm a huge fan of his research on disobedience and labor movements. He visited a few years ago this class to talk about the radical Martin Luther King Jr. He's at work now on a book on the politics of strikes. And today he is going to talk about necessary labor, why a UBI can be a path to a post-work future. Thank you so much for joining us, Alex.
Thank you, Candice. That was a really nice introduction, especially happy that someone mentioned I'm from Southern California. It never happened in an introduction for me. The most important thing about me, not my ideas. Yes, today I want to talk to you about a very simple idea, deceptively simple idea, which is the idea of a universal basic income. How many of you have heard of the idea of a universal basic income? So we're all acquainted with this idea. It's become very popular. It started as a kind of idea in a few obscure academies and a few scholars, and somehow over the last 20 years in particular, it's acquired immense popularity. Lots of politicians who run on it. I think that actually in Cambridge, where I live, we're about to have a basic income pilot. And so there's a huge number of proposals for universal basic income and a huge number of arguments for it. And what I want to talk to you about today is a particular subset of these arguments for universal basic income, which you find mostly on the left. which is the idea that a universal basic income is an emancipatory social policy. And it's an emancipatory ideal because it will free people not just from the kind of drudgery and discipline of capitalist labor markets and work under capitalism, but that more generally it can free people from having to work at all. And this is an idea that has become very popular, in particular on the left, among people who consider themselves post-work and think about socialism as representing a kind of post-work utopia. Because what they imagine a certain ideal of a free society to be is one in which nobody is forced to work, and nobody is forced to work means that then everybody has lots and lots of free time. But more deeply, it's not just that nobody's forced to work, and nobody's forced to work because they get this universal basic income, but that this post-work utopia will be a society in which there isn't even a work ethic. There is no cultural pressure on people to work at all. So it's a liberated society because it's a kind of hedonistic ideal where because we get this universal basic income, nobody's forced to work, and because there's no cultural pressure on people to like make something of themselves or get a job, you gotta get a job. Like I'm sure a lot of you, your parents are like, what are you gonna do after college? Why aren't you doing something in college? Where are you hanging out? You know, that kind of thing. So imagine it's sort of like the ideal of college writ large, right? For those of you who don't have to work. I imagine some of you do have to work to get through college. But for those who don't, you know, it's like classes and you hang out. So this is the vision of a post-work utopia. Nobody's forced to do anything in particular. There's a general cultural celebration of idleness, laziness. But it wouldn't be called laziness, right? It's one where, you know, people just have free time to hang out and socialize or make something of themselves if they want to, but nobody particularly cares if you do. And this has become a very attractive ideal to people, and the universal basic income sits at the center of it, because they see it not just as the policy that will make it so that nobody's forced to work, but they also see it as a kind of weapon in a culture war against the work ethic. Because they say, you know, the biggest obstacle that we face in convincing people of the value of universal basic income is that there's popular resistance to it, because people think you ought to work. Oh, am I walking out of camera? Should I be staying live? Or does it matter? No, okay. So they forgot that there's a hi, hello to everyone online. So this is the ideal that you find, and I want to address this particular set of arguments for universal basic income. So there might be others that people find compelling. I'm not talking about that. I'm interested in this freedom-based argument for a universal basic income that comes from the post-work idea. Everybody get the general gist of the, okay. Now this is a vision. How many people find it compelling? How many people say this actually sounds pretty good? Don't be shy. I'm not judging. I'll judge you all later. But at the moment, right. I found it pretty compelling too. This is an ideal that I thought, yeah, this is what a free society is really about. It's one in where nobody feels any compulsion to work, nobody's forced to work, we're freed from all the discipline and drudgery and burdensomeness of work. This is good, this is freedom. But what's happened is, over the past few years, I've come to doubt myself and this vision. And so what I want to see if I can convince you all of is that this argument is not just that there's something kind of mistaken or wrong about it as a moral idea, but it's deceptive, it's self-contradictory. It is on its own terms contradictory, it doesn't work. And for that reason, it's both an intellectual and a political mistake. And that there's in fact some very good reasons why people remain attached to work and even think it would be right for everyone to feel like they should do some work, that they should do their fair share. So against this post-work vision of a universal basic income and a non-work society, I am proposing, and have now found myself more compelled by what I would call sort of shared labor socialism. One in which we explicitly and directly acknowledge that some labor is necessary, and the primary social task is to figure out what labor is necessary and who should do it under what conditions. And that the fundamental principle should be the ideal that we all ought to feel some obligation to do our fair share of the labor so that nobody has to do too much and nobody ends up having to do too much, right? And so everyone ends up with free time if we all share the labor. And so it's deceptive to present an image of society as if nobody in particular has to do any particular work. So this is what I'd like to try and convince you of. And if at any moment something I say is confusing or unclear, just raise your hand and interrupt me. And I want to make sure that we follow the steps of the argument, because I think one thing that happens with the universal basic income is that it seems so direct and simple. It's so easy to understand, and it seems impossible to argue with, because why wouldn't you want that? And what I want to say is, of course we would want that, but you can't have it, at least not as it's presented. There is some labor that is necessary, and you can't get around the fact that collectively we have to decide how we're going to identify what that labor is and institutionally guarantee how to do it, and that it will be performed. Yes?
So at present, maybe you'll go over this, but just so I can follow, you're not necessarily against UBI overall, just UBI as a means for this emancipation from the work ethic.
I'm not against, there's so many different arguments for a UBI that I can't say I'm for or against it, because I think that it's like one of those things where precisely because so many people can agree on it, they're not actually agreeing. And you'll end up like defending something that isn't, it turns out, what it was you thought you're defending, and now you've just lent the weight of your argument to something that's quite bad. So like there are right-wing defenders who want to liquidate the entire welfare state into just a monthly cash payout. That's pretty different. That's not emancipating. That just incorporates people more heavily into the market, right? But they are for a universal basic income, and they rightly notice that one thing it could do is reduce the paternalism of the welfare state we actually have. So what I want to spend some time doing is spend a little more time with what I take the left-wing argument for universal basic income to be, so we know what we're arguing about, and then say that this is deceptive. It doesn't even work on its own terms, and therefore people aren't wrong to be a little bit suspicious of it. And it's important, these kinds of things are important when you're trying to present an ideal of an alternative society that you want people to like fight for and struggle for. So I'm against the version of the argument I'm going to present, which I think is common and widespread. I think it affects a lot of other arguments for the basic income, though. So this will track into other arguments I didn't discuss, but which fail in the same way. The fundamental failure is a deception about how to deal with the problem of necessary labor. Okay, so let's take a step back. What do people say? Let's first appreciate the anti-work argument for universal basic income. What is it? What's a UBI? That's short for, the people in the know, the fanatics. They don't say universal basic income, they say UBI. I've spent some time in that crowd, and they don't even introduce it. They don't say universal basic income, UBI. They just start saying UBI. And that's how you know you're in the in-group. So we can be in the in-group now. So what is a universal basic income? It's universal because the idea is everyone gets it. Every member of society gets one. Right? Because it's universal, it's also said to be unconditional. These things, I know this seems pedantic, but it's important that we understand them, because there's no way to understand why people think it's emancipating if you don't understand the actual terms of the idea. So it's said to be unconditional in the sense that you get it unconditionally. Compare that with like how you normally get money. It's conditional on you working, right? Most people can only work conditional on finding a job and negotiating a wage, and then on actually doing the work. So a UBI is normally thought to be unconditional in the sense that it's not conditional on working. This exists. Some of these things exist. For instance, in Alaska, people get a universal basic income just for being a citizen of Alaska, so long as they haven't committed a felony, right? So it's conditional on not being a felon, but it's unconditional in the normal sense of not being conditional on working. It's because Alaska owns the pipeline and it takes state revenues and pays it out to everyone in Alaska. So that's the sense in which it's unconditional. And you can see how then why people might think it's a way of freeing people from work discipline. Because if you can get an income without having to work, now you have an alternative source of income. It's called a basic income, so it's a universal basic income because it's understood to be at a level high enough to meet all of your basic needs. That's a really important stipulation because there are universal incomes you can get that aren't that high, which would mean they wouldn't be sufficient for you to live on. Right? So there's a question, how do we know what that is? That's a bit of a black box. Let's just take the poverty line in the United States as a very conservative measure, but a measure. So like for a single person would get, I think, about $17,000 or $18,000 per year on this, right? So it's universal, everyone gets it. It's unconditional in the sense that it's not conditional on you working. It's basic in the sense that it's at a level high enough to meet all of your basic needs. So we'll call it $18,000. You can do 15 in your head if the math's easier. And it's an income, it's money, right? It's like, the COVID checks some of you might have gotten, right? It just shows up in your mailbox or direct deposit in your bank account, whatever, right? Just a cash payout. Now, it's not hard to see why people would think this is emancipating, right? Because now, if somebody can meet all of their basic needs without working, they're not forced to work. The way our capitalist society normally works is about 80% of the population is forced to work. They're forced to work not because someone shows up with a gun and says, you have to go to work today, but they have no other reliable means of getting the stuff they need. You have to find a job, earn the money, use that money to buy the things because they're only available on the market, right? You can't take it from people, you can't take food from people, you go to jail, right? Obvious. So about 80% of the population is forced to find some job, any job, in order to meet their basic needs. So this would immediately make, if everybody, on the argument for the UBI, if everyone got it, it would immediately make the bottom 80% similar to the very wealthy. Not the same, obviously, but similar in the specific sense that they're not forced to work. The very wealthy in this society are not forced to work. Some of them do, but they're not forced to work because they can live off dividends and financial assets and passive income that they get, right? Fanatics like Bezos, work like dogs, even though they're could live 10,000 years and not have to work on the income they currently possess, right? So that's different. But so on this view, right, you could see why a UBI would be the foundation of a post-work utopia, because now nobody is forced to work. They can meet all of their basic needs with a universal basic income, and whether they work or not, maybe people will want to work, it's a free choice. Now, the post-work people add the thought that since we live in this society, and this society gets, in this capitalist society, and this society gets people to work not just by forcing them to work, but by creating the work ethic, an ideological apparatus that convinces people that they have a social obligation to work and to find a job, regardless of the human need that it satisfies, so long as they find a paying job. That there's a deep problem. A UBI is insufficient because people will resist it because they think, oh, that's just for lazy people. Why should we pay people for not doing anything? That's irresponsible. That violates our basic sense that people should have to work for their, that people should have to work for their bread. Although, why the wealthy who don't have to work for their bread then? The wealth is never quite explained, but whatever, doesn't matter, right? That's still the general ideology. And so they say, look, the point of the UBI is to raise the question of work and to point out that work basically sucks. Right? What makes this compelling is the fact that lots of jobs suck. They're boring, they're dangerous, the bosses are assholes, right? They don't develop any of your abilities, they serve totally pointless needs, right? So even if they aren't horrendous, why should people be forced to build yachts? Why should anyone have been forced to build the yacht that Jeff Bezos has to take to his bigger yacht? Because his bigger yacht is so big, it can't dock in a normal port. Right? This is true fact. He had to build a smaller yacht, right, that costs more than the house of 95% of the people in the United States. Why should anyone have to be forced to make like nice sweaters for overpaid college professors, right? If people want to, that's fine, but nobody should be forced to do that, right? At most, maybe people should be forced to meet, basic human needs. But in most of the jobs are either pointless, dangerous, burdensome, or all together. So surely, and people kind of know this, but they think they're under some obligation nonetheless to do it. So the UBI is a way to attack this, but we have to attack this by saying the great thing about the future, the thing that will be aspirational about a post-work future, is not just that people will have this income, but that will also have defeated the work ethic itself. So there will be no external economic compulsion to work and no ideological or cultural pressure. Here's the problem. Sounds good. How many people are still on board? I've slightly judged this poll by saying here's the problem and then asking for an opinion. But honesty is good. I should have, I have thought this way until like 2 years ago. So there's nothing wrong with having found this compelling. I think it's important to find this compelling. But so far, who finds that general image compelling? It doesn't have to be right, but compelling. Still. Some people are still on board. Okay, cool. Well, here's the problem. This way of thinking says the core of it wants us to believe that you can give everybody a universal basic income, and everyone can use that universal basic income to meet their basic needs without there being any social decision about what labor is necessary and any social institutions to guarantee that that necessary labor will be performed. It makes it look like we're free because nobody in particular has to do any labor, and we as a society don't have to create any work obligations at all. But if that's the case, then where are the basic goods that everyone's going to buy with their universal basic income supposed to come from? Think about how UBI works. This is one of the most, it's such a simple thought that it's, when it first occurred to me, I was sure that there was like a very clear and convincing answer to this question. And it doesn't look like there is one. Right? So how is UBI supposed to work? You get money, you go to the store, and you buy your basic goods, right? That's why it's emancipated, right? You buy your food, you buy your clothing, whatever it is. But that means a UBI is only emancipating not just if you get the income, but if the income can in fact be used to buy the basic goods. So it presupposes that there are basic goods to buy on the market. Not just that, it presupposes that there are enough of those basic goods so that everyone could buy them, right? So that it presupposes not just that there is food, but that there's lots of it. And it presupposes not just that there is clothing, but that there's lots of it. Because if there was a little bit, we would just end up in the bidding war with our universal basic income, drive up the price of food to the point where we'd inflated away the value of the UBI, right? So that means that on the post-work vision, we're presupposing a huge amount of production without explaining why we would think that production takes place. The UBI can only work not just if somebody has been willing to go to work, but if enough people are willing to do the specific required kinds of labor such that the basic goods are available for us to buy. And not just today and tomorrow, but every day, which means that other people have done the work to invest in future production, to develop the raw materials, the energy, the wood, the coal, the plastic, who knows, whatever it takes to go in to the machine maintenance, the building maintenance, the housing maintenance, right? All this stuff to make sure that we can produce the basic goods in the future. And yet, the post-work argument for a UBI doesn't tell us why or what mechanism is going to guarantee that that necessary labor is going to be done. In fact, we have every reason to think it wouldn't get done. Right? A lot of that work is some of the worst work in society. The minute anyone had a UBI, they would leave it. Has anyone looked? Just go online and do some video searches for industrialized agriculture. Like watch like migrant laborers on cabbage picking farms, right? Or I've worked on farms. If any of you have ever picked strawberries, it is unbelievably unpleasant. And there's no way anyone who picks strawberries, if they had a UBI, would continue to pick strawberries. No way. You can say, well, people don't eat strawberries. Just multiply across all food, okay? Anyone been to a slaughterhouse? Anyone read about slaughterhouses? Meat goes away, right? That might be a problem. It might be a problem if we can only have this kind of food on condition that we make that work really unpleasant. But then it doesn't solve the problem to say, okay, well then let's not have it. We do need food, right? And that's implied across all necessary goods, however we define them. Yeah.
So are you saying like UBI, the concept of UBI is like contradicting itself because, you know, it's eliminating foreign labor, but in turn it's actually creating like this kind of labor?
Good, exactly. So the question was, if you couldn't hear it, am I accusing UBI of contradicting itself? Yes. This argument for the UBI, yes. But in a specific way. The vision it presents of freedom is one in which we do not need to make any social decision about what counts as necessary labor, nor do we need any institutional guarantees that that necessary labor will be performed. And that's why it's a free society, right? Not only is it the case that nobody's individually forced to work because they get the UBI, but we're not creating even any cultural expectations. There's no obligations on people to do it. On the other hand, the UBI only works if all of this labor is getting performed. And the contradiction, I think, is even worse because not only do they not admit that you have to give some account of why necessary labor is going to be produced, but on their own vision, we have no reason to think that that labor will be done. Because the two central mechanisms for getting people to work, which in a capitalist society are very unfair and exploitative mechanisms, are eliminated. Economic necessity, well, it's eliminated, right? Everyone's got the UBI. They supposedly can live off it, so why would they go work? And they imagine that we've also defeated the work ethic, right? That's a really important part of the post-work vision. People don't even feel any culture pressure, so there's no even obligation. And I think, therefore, this is a deceptive and mistaken way of thinking about the connection between work and freedom. I think that the proper way to think about the connection between work and freedom is to embrace the criticism of the way work is organized in our society. It's deeply unfair because some people are forced to work at crappy jobs while others aren't forced to work at all, right? Some people are forced to work for needs nobody should be forced to work for, right? And to recognize the impulse about why we would just want to free everybody from any work obligation at all, but recognize that's a mistake. What is needed is first and foremost a collective decision to take responsibility for identifying what human needs are important and vital enough that somebody should do the labor to meet those needs, and then to think about a fair way of distributing that labor. And I think the proper vision is not a post-work one, but instead a very classic idea you find in the 19th and 20th century, but is something like shared labor socialism, which is the idea that every able-bodied person should do their fair share of the necessary labor. It's not right that I get to be a professor without having to do any of the necessary labor. I mean, yes, being a professor and educating the youth, or miseducating the youth, is one form of necessary labor. But there are forms of necessary labor that nobody particularly wants to do. Okay? So in particular, those kinds, the kinds that are basically burdens, right? And that you have to explicit, and we came, interestingly enough, in COVID in a weird way, we came very close to admitting this as a problem. There was this weird category of essential worker. But then somehow, like, Amazon warehouse worker became essential, right? So really, it was essential to the professional class who wanted to stay home and Zoom, while the working class brought them things. That's how it got defined in our society, right? That's what it really meant. But there's a fairer way to do this, which is every able-bodied person has to do their fair share of the labor, and if everybody does it, nobody has to spend very much of their life doing it, and therefore everybody still has a lot of free time. And even more, I think this is the even more interesting thought about this shared labor socialist view is, if you have a work ethic, right, a socialist one, not a capitalist one, which is like any job, get a job, any job. But if you have one that's based on this idea, that people should only feel an obligation and there should only be a social obligation to do a fair share of just the necessary, then, first of all, I don't think anyone would actually be forced to work. And they wouldn't be forced to work because if a particular person or a few people didn't do their labor, there would be enough people ready to do the necessary labor that it would still get done. So long as there's enough people ready to step in and do their fair share, we know that no particular individual would be forced to do it. Because if they didn't do it, and there'll always be some shirkers who won't do it, if they didn't do it, still there'd be enough people to do all the necessary labor that would get done. But more than that, I think that work would be something that people could do freely. Work would not be a mere external imposition the way it is in our society. In our society, it is an external imposition because people are just forced to do it, and they have no role in deciding, well, which of these things really are human needs? Which of these things are really important enough that people ought to do it? But if you take explicit and direct social democratic control of making that decision, and it's shared in a fair way, then it would be reasonable for people to view doing that activity as a duty, as a civic service, as a form of solidarity, and therefore something they don't just have to do, but something they will do freely, willingly, because they see the reason for it and its value. So that's, and that way of doing it also solves the problem of what's the prior social task. The prior social task is figuring out and making a social choice about what is necessary labor and who's going to do it. And notice in this vision of a shared labor society, you don't need to force people to do it. You don't need to withhold benefits. You could still say to everyone, you're all guaranteed your social needs. But because we are committed to everyone doing their fair share, it would be maintained entirely through social expectation and norms and a particular kind of pulpit culture. So this is the thought. So to put I'll stop here, but just to put the two thoughts together then. One was the critical thought about the post-work defense of UBI. And the second was this very sketchy alternative idea. The one I want to emphasize above all is the critical one, which is however attractive this vision of the UBI as an emancipatory instrument, it can't work because the argument's concealing really crucial, necessary details that aren't, as it turns out, details. The UBI only works the way its proponents work if a whole bunch of people are doing this necessary labor, yet it never explains why they're working, nor why the particular work that gets done is done in a fair and acceptable way. And that's a problem, and that's why when people resist it, they're not doing it just because they're trapped in a capitalist work ethic. There's a reasonable thought that a lot of people have that they should feel some sense that they have some duty to do some share of the labor. That reasonable and valuable thought that many people have is what, I think, the capitalist work ethic seizes on and distorts, right? Rather than just invents out of whole cloth. Okay, and then I propose my little alternative of a shared labor socialism, which I think has a long history we can talk about as a possible way of thinking about the alternative. But that was 30 minutes, so happy to, hopefully that was clear enough to you all that and outrageous enough that you have some questions.
All right. Excellent. Very provocative. Thanks, Alex. So, yeah, we're going to take questions. Okay. Drew.
So
if these low desirability but necessary jobs were to be automated, could that maybe solve this problem that you've identified?
Great. So I'm glad you asked that question. So automation is often trotted out as like solution, right? And one thing is to ask what automation means. So as I understand automation, automation means the total replacement of labor by machine, right? Because sometimes people, while that seems pedantic, sometimes people confuse the introduction of machines that incredibly increases human productivity but doesn't eliminate human labor itself. So there's a lot of areas of the economy where you can reduce the amount of human labor necessary by like 90%. You can't get rid, it's almost impossible to get rid of that last 10% or something like that. In which case, we're not quite talking about automation because there's still that stuff. But more generally, I think the problem with automation is there's many kinds of necessary labor that in the near future can't imagine being completely automated. Either because the machines create new forms of human labor necessary to maintain the machines or fix them, or because the activities themselves do not seem to be amenable to automation, or they are by nature interpersonal. So some people at least feel that things like education, we went through a test the last 2 years, you know, how much can you automate education? It seemed to dramatically degrade the kind and quality of the thing being given people. So you can't do that. Looks like healthcare is not automatable entirely. Some is, but a lot isn't. A lot of construction doesn't seem automatable. So, which is a surprising thing, turns out. I think one would expect that to be a high automatable activity. But so the thought is, first, in the near term, in the next 50, 100 years, I can't imagine all forms of necessary labor being automated. So we would be, just on that front, either we have to wait until it is, which seems like a long and unnecessary amount of time to wait, this hellhole, for that to happen. But more generally, I think even in principle, there's some kinds of necessary labor that can't be automated. And so, but the even more fundamental, that's a common level of debate. What I wanted to say about necessary labor is to say even more fundamental than that, though, automation can't be a solution until we've decided collectively what the human needs are, and then what counts as a necessary labor such that we know what to automate. So I think the automation discussion suffers from an even more fundamental but unspecified problem, which is automation isn't a solution until we know the problem. The problem is a social and political one, which is how we decide what counts as human needs, such that we know what are the kinds of labor that matter, that should count as necessary labor. And we have to do that before automation could really be a solution at all. So in the society I imagine, the shared labor socialist one, where we've taken collective control of the process of determining needs, then I think automation would play a huge role. But because we've already now set up a political process for deciding which things to automate. Right now, the things that get automated get decided not by a collective democratic decision, but by the profit motives of capitalists. We have no reason to think in this society that automation would be used to reduce necessary human labor so that everybody would have more free time. It works the other way around. Automation puts people out of work.
Margarita?
Yeah, I had a question about, do you see a way for more kind of existing mechanisms within capitalist society, such as collective bargaining, for instance, that could arrive at making these undesirable jobs more desirable by putting wage premiums and restricting the amount of hours that people can work without going through this other process? And also, could you talk about more about that, what that other process would look like, the shared socialism?
Good. So what I like about collective bargaining is that in a small-scale form, it does present us with an alternative image that writ large would be a bit more like the shared labor socialist view I'm thinking about, because the way collective bargaining works is that it involves not just each individual bargaining on a market about what they can manage to get, but involves collective determinations about what is reasonable to demand of people on the job. It's still very constrained by the wider economy, by the profitability of the enterprise, those kinds of things. And so it does often reduce to just a way of increasing the economic bargaining power of the people involved. But it is interesting that even in those situations, there are always elements of bargaining that are not just about wages and hours and benefits, but also about what is reasonable to demand of people. If you compare the contracts people sign when they're not in a union with with a union contracts are much longer. And that's not just because it specifies more clearly wages and benefits. It specifies things like grievance procedures, right? And working conditions, and what the legal rights of workers are and aren't. And that, in a nutshell, is a bit closer to the idea of democratically deciding what's it reasonable to expect people to do, and how do we balance that with what is it that people need. But I imagine that to be a qualitatively different process than collective bargaining, because collective bargaining is ultimately negotiation between two parties, where the third parties are not really considered, whereas a democratic process in principle would take into account everyone's interests. Or it's formally at least a way of taking into account everyone's interests, and of publicly acknowledging that we can't get around the question of the political determination of needs.
Owen.
Yeah, so first off, thank you for coming to speak. I thought it's a really interesting debate. I guess my question is kind of a bit of a two-pronged approach. The first part is that I question whether or not UBI is like an idealist end goal, or if it's just kind of a midpoint between our current capitalist structure and some future goal.
Yeah.
And depending on kind of what that answer looks like, I think my second question is almost like, why is this kind of the idea? Because I do think that while a UBI is good, you made a really important point that, you know, it would lack a lot of motivation, and it also could just really increase inflation versus what I see other kind of end goals looking like, you know, Marxists would just say to completely destroy the system and start from scratch, basically, or just completely take over everything. I kind of question, what does that look like from a UBI standpoint?
Good. So one is, isn't this a midpoint? And then the second is, since it's so limited, what's the bigger transformative idea? Just for the record, I feel like it's the anarchists who want to smash the system. I feel like the Marxist position has always been preserve what's good, get rid of what's bad, and raise it to a higher level. Kind of like there. Just for the record, if we're going to be sectarian, which I'm going to be sectarian. It's the anarchists who go to listen to Rage Against the Machine, not the Marxists, you know. Or maybe those of us from Southern California. All the radicals I grew up with, they either listened to Pearl Jam and became nihilists, or listened to Rage Against the Machine and protested against globalization. The anarchist, anti-globalization protesters. So that's my cultural frame of reference. So it's good that you raised the question. Isn't this, aren't I exaggerating? This idea that UBI is part of this post-work socialist utopia, that might be one argument. What are these other arguments? It's a good question. This is what makes it hard. This is a bit what makes it hard to talk about the UBI. Because you've just got, it's like whack-a-mole. You know, it's like, no, it's not part of work post-utopia. No, I'm just talking about reform here. And then you're like, okay, but then you just want to keep capitalism. No, it's a pathway to communism. No, it's going to save the climate. You know, it's emancipation of women from the household. And you just don't know. So that's why I was like trying to control this. In this vision, right, doesn't work. But then what about this other way? And this has been made to me. Actually, the overwhelming and predominant argument for UBI is not that it's part of some future socialist utopia, but that it's an achievable reform here and now that would have some emancipatory effects and set the stage for a wider transformation of society. And actually, it was criticizing this view, that, and writing and criticizing that view, that I started to realize about the other. Because then when I criticized that view, people said, no, we weren't talking about a reform here and now. We're radicals and revolutionaries. We're talking about in a future society. So now I've got to go, back to the first moment. The problem is this, with this idea of a thing, which is that the standard argument is, look, a universal basic income, precisely because it's just a single payout that would require very little new legislation, would be easy to administer, and doesn't involve like directly expropriating anybody's property, is actually a much more feasible goal than any of the harder things like labor organizing or any of the traditional left-wing aims, and would be easier to build political consensus, and would have the added benefit that it will ease the pressure, the market pressure on people, so it will be immediately liberating. And because it'll be immediately liberating, then maybe people can start bargaining their way towards more social, use it as a permanent strike fund or any of those kinds of things. This is, to my mind, this is an even more massive deception. And here's why. First of all, any serious UBI would involve an immense expropriation of wealth from the wealthy. I won't bore you with the calculations, but I can port you to the article where a friend and I sat down to try and understand why we would expect massive, like truly massive political resistance from the wealthy and employers if something like a true UBI were even to get off the ground in any serious way, where we're talking about not just a one-time payoff, right, in the midst of a pandemic, but a really institutionalized thing. Here's why. Let's take $15,000 as the value. And you can't get rid of any of the important bits of the welfare state, right? Because once you start doing that, you're just doing the right-wing thing of liquidating the welfare state, not actually providing everybody's needs. Because you still need public education, you still need Medicare, right? You still need roads and all the other things, right? You still need Social Security. But even if you liquidate Social Security, you run the numbers, and it would require taxing an additional 25% of GDP in order to finance that UBI. And all of that would have to come from the top 20%. Because otherwise, you wouldn't be giving people UBI, right? If 100% of the population are going to get this $15,000 a year, you can't finance it by taxing it, right? Otherwise, it's no longer UBI. It's like conditional on giving it back, right? So it has to be that everybody, 100% of people are getting $15,000 a year without having to give any of that back, which means you have to take all of it from the top 20% by taxing their wealth and income. That amounts to extracting 25 additional percentage. That would put the total government share of GDP at above any of the social democracies of Scandinavia, right? It would put it at a higher share of GDP than even during World War II. So it's a truly massive expropriation of wealth. I'm quite confident that the wealthy won't like that. And there's a further reason why they won't like that, beyond not wanting to have that wealth taxed away, which is that in this society, we're talking about a reform that's supposed to be feasible here and now. If you give everybody this UBI, it will relax work discipline. And employers aren't going to like that. And we have super consistent polling data on stuff about this, right? Really consistent. If you want to put Harriet Tubman on a dollar bill, they're all for it, right? If you want to engage in some finance-friendly climate policy, they're all for it. If you want to give people work unconditional payouts that will allow them not to work, they are 100% against it. This is like their most fundamental commitment. You go across all social, cultural, welfare policy, you'll get overlaps on cultural policy, you get overlaps in certain way on certain kinds of climate policy, right? Because you're just paying corporations not to produce stuff, or you're guaranteeing their losses and they get all the benefits, fine. When it comes to labor policy, absolutely not. So the only, because what this supposedly feasible immediate policy is is a form of socialism. So they're going to resist it, which means the only way you can get it is if you already have an extremely well mobilized working class with a properly organized working class party that has already managed to socialize the economy, right? So in fact, it's presupposing the politics that it's supposed to be a means to. I think there's a funny structure with all this stuff, that it kind of presupposes the thing that it says it's a means to. So the reason that the stepping stone argument doesn't work is that it's wildly, not just a little bit, wildly politically unfeasible, and even more unfeasible than the seemingly difficult but prior task of labor organizing. Because it's only feasible when you already have this incredibly well-organized working class that could already expropriate an additional 25% of the wealth against the resistance of the employers and the wealthy. Right? So it's just not politically possible. And if you ignored all of that and said it would still be emancipating, it's not even emancipating in a capitalist society, because if everyone had this UBI, you have the same problem of where are the goods going to come from that they're buying. It still affects them. It still affects capitalism here now, except you've added all of the capitalist market discipline to all of the other problems that would exist in the post-work socialist utopia. I can say more about that, but it doesn't even emancipate here now.
Shannon.
So in this like idealized world, obviously like the basic labor is divided towards everyone. So in my mind, would that like render the idea of higher education like unnecessary? Because like I feel like doctors and like obviously people who work in government would be necessary in like basic labor, but you need a higher education in order to pursue those.
Oh, I see. Yeah, good. So here's another reason why good. I'm glad you brought that up, because I didn't get a chance to say it, but there's another feature of a shared labor socialist society that gives us reason to think we might end up with, in certain ways, more necessary labor rather than less, which is that the standard way in which I have always thought about utopian thinking, or at least a certain kind of Marxian-inspired utopian thinking, is that a future society would see the expansion of human needs. It's in this society that we imagine needs to just be the means of subsistence, or the things you need just to survive. But it's, for those of you who've read your Marx, what's he saying in Critique of the Gotha program? That labor goes from being a means to life's prime want. What does he mean by that? He means that everybody would be able to develop some talent and ability, develop a rich individuality, and that would become the basis for being able to contribute and realize that talent and ability in society. But in a highly technological and advanced society like ours, and that everybody, including the global south, has a right to, that would mean everybody should be getting an education, or it should be available to everybody to get an education, and a good one. But think of the resources that require. How many of you had a chemistry class in high school? How many of you used hydrochloric sulfate? Right? How many of you had to dissect owl pellets in your biology class? Yeah, we all, yeah, I remember that one. The rat bones. Right? It requires research. You need beakers. And now imagine, like, some of you who went to like a good high school. Okay. So you remember like what all the apparatus was like. There were like a lot of beakers. And I don't know what a chemistry class is like anymore, actually. Maybe, I don't know. But it had a lot of stuff. And then how many of you went to like a crappy high school? Whereas like, what was your chemistry class like? Did you have one?
Yeah, it was like we didn't have that much stuff, but like
Yeah.
we made it work.
So like in a proper future society, chemistry class doesn't look like that. It looks like the good ones. And then everybody in the whole world gets to have one of those classes. So that means because it's part of if we understand the development and realization of some human abilities and talents as a need, as something that's owed to everyone, then someone's got to do the work to make that possible, which means more teachers and more resources for teachers. My kids went to glorious daycare with all kinds of cool stuff. And I've seen some really crappy daycares with less cool stuff. You need a lot of childcare, right? But it's not just the human beings. You need labor to produce the stuff that makes those, nice daycares. So higher education could, in principle, have more employment because it will be considered necessary. and it'll be considered necessary because we think everyone should have the opportunity to develop and realize those abilities if they want. Or at least we'd have to have that debate and discussion rather than just leave it up to the automatic decisions of like private donors in the market, right? But there's reason to think that when we have a more expansive conception of human needs, we need more labor to meet those needs. And I think that if we consider what that would mean on a global scale and not just a national scale, it would, at least for a time, require quite a colossal amount of labor, much of it rewarding, I think. But it wouldn't be one in which nobody would have any expectation they wouldn't have to do anything, right? It would mean instead kind of understanding how our individuality presupposes a certain kind of a social organization, and therefore, in some ways, we owe something to it at the same time. So that would be my answer to the higher education problem that extends well past higher education to many other kinds of labor.
You're on.
So in both the traditional system of UBI that you laid out, and then also your socialism system, there's a change in mindset around work ethic.
Yeah.
How do you think that would come about? Do you think that it would require us to institute a UBI for people to be okay with this mindset, or do you think that we would have to change our mindset for UBI to even be instituted?
Good. So what I think is that the post-work defenders of a UBI imagine that they can just win a culture war. And I'm with them on thinking the economy is a culture and that you have to win a culture. It's not just a place where we produce things. It's where fundamental questions about human need and power and authority and work and value are decided. So I don't like culture war because of the form it takes in our society, but in part because I think it's a distraction, in certain ways, from where the culture war ought to happen. But their version of the culture war I just don't find convincing, because on the one hand, they want us to think that all of our attachments to work and all of our sense that work is in some way an obligation, that there's any duties of reciprocity, is just a capitalist illusion. It's just a way of inducing people to submit to their own exploitation. And I think that's a mistake. I think the ideology works by seizing on something that is reasonable and is the foundation for this shared labor socialist work ethic that I was talking about. And the reason I think, in a way, my argument's more reasonable and feasible is precisely because we can tap into things that people already believe and find reasonable. Many people think, well, you shouldn't just lay about. You owe something in virtue of being able to take advantage of the benefits of society. And then people are reasonably resentful of that claim when it turns out it's why you've got to work at Foot Locker for 40 years, right? Or in an Amazon warehouse for 40 years. So the resentment's also reasonable. But the way is trying to figure out how to unite the already and fully reasonable beliefs and resentments about the book. And I don't find the post-work way feasible doing it because it just cancels it and then doesn't have an answer for us about how you're going to end up with work. Whereas I think the way the argument would go and how you could inspire people, more likely to inspire people, because of the internal consistency of the vision, but also because it taps into some already existing beliefs about the value and duty of work, is to explain, look, yeah, people get taken advantage of all the time in this society. But the realization of what you already believe is only possible in this one. So the trick, I think, in transformative politics is to show how there's a desire and a belief that people already have that is unrealizable in this society. So not that it's a future society that's just wildly and totally the negative of this one. That's what I think the post-war vision is. One of the problems with it, which gives you the feeling, the frisson of something being radical, but at the same time, since it's just the negative mirror image of this one, doesn't even escape it.
Sally.
So, are you reading that?
I realized there's a chat, but I'm listening.
Okay. So.
Oh, there you are. Sorry.
Right here. So with the shared socialism idea, how would that impact the global south further with outsourcing of labor
Good.
overseas? Like, I feel like if we're
further taxing the wealthy, and people are incentivized not to work, would that cause a further exploitation of the global south? And would that also create more demand? Because I feel like a lot of people wouldn't want to give up their like social norms, like I guess like college students buying sushi and like $5 coffees every day. Like nobody wants to give that like life up. So how would that be affected?
Might have to give up some of that, but yeah, I get your point. I get your point. I don't want to have to give up sushi either, but might have to. No, so it's good. So let me talk about the global south point first, and then maybe we can connect it to what is it we'd have to give up and what would we gain. So the global south issue is, I think, a big question for two reasons. One is, I think that the reason it has become possible for people to imagine that you could automate away all the jobs is that this period, which has been understood as a period of wild automation, has in fact been a period of the massive globalization of production and of deindustrialization in large parts of the North, which means that much more of what we consume isn't produced here. It's produced in the South. And this has created a detachment between how we think about entitlements and the labor that makes those entitlements possible. If you think about the deep problem with the UBI is the sense in which we think we can give everyone this universal entitlement in the absence of any account of why we think the production's going to get done to make that entitlement real. We can give people all this money and they can buy stuff without explaining where it's coming from. And I think the major reason it looks like you can do this is not, in fact, automation, but deindustrialization and globalization, which are kind of the same thing. And a lot of experiments that UBI defenders point to, the local ones in Manitoba or whatever, function because people are consuming things produced in China, India, Mexico, Guam, right, Vietnam, places that are not doing, that where you couldn't, if you really had a UBI, then we would really be unable to consume all those things because they don't want to, shrimp processors don't want to do slave labor in shrimp warehouses in Vietnam for us to have our tobacco-covered shrimp roll, whatever, right? Or whatever. Is that what to be? I cut that wrong, but you know what I mean. So I think that's the first thing, is it's actually the fact that a huge amount of labor is done producing the stuff that we consume elsewhere, which makes it look like on a national scale we could have UBI without solving the problem of labor almost at all. Okay, we got to have some teachers and nurses, is sort of. But actually, that's because we're consuming things that are being produced elsewhere, and they're cheap because of the way they're produced elsewhere. We have to worry about the inflation problem so much. Okay. The second thing, though, is my response to, sorry, what's your name? Shannon. I said more about this expansion of needs and giving everybody on a global scale the real opportunity to develop their abilities. I think that in this future society, given the pretty considerable exploitation of the global South, those of us in the North with already highly developed economies would owe an extra work obligation to the South, the global South, to help it develop industrially so that people there would have these opportunities that are currently only available to us. So for the moment, a whole bunch of extra labor is being done in the global South to meet needs in the global North. And I think the inverse would be part of the early days of a shared labor socialism. Right? You need to build a heck of a lot of stuff. It's like proper sewage lines and transportation lines, but also properly built schools, properly built energy grids, all those things, and we'd owe it to them. And how that would be organized, open question, right? But as a general matter, I think that's what would be organized. So it wouldn't be post-work. It would actually be, I think we'd all be under some obligation to go contribute extra amounts to compensate for what's been extracted from them. And that would mean certainly the reorganization of production. I'm inclined to think that if everybody were willing to do their fair share of the work, which would, and in a future, in a shared labor socialist society, which would also mean getting rid of a lot of pointless jobs and directing human labor to the actually needed activities. It would be very disruptive at first, but I think it would not lead to a dramatic decline in our consumption levels very much at all. Because you would have a massive diversion of human labor. You'd have a massive mobilization of human effort that isn't mobilized, right? All these, people who don't particularly work, don't work particularly much at that point. And then add to that people doing jobs that they no longer, pointless jobs, right? We wouldn't be making yachts anymore. And guard labor. Guard labor accounts for somewhere between a sixth and a tenth of American employment. Right? Because that's what you need in an economy based on coercing people into doing jobs that they're exploited when they're doing. Right? So you could actually have, I think, a net dramatic increase. And there's a huge amount of marginally employed labor. The other feature of our society is massively underemployed labor, especially in the global south. Given the resources, you would actually have a massive increase in human productivity, which I think would not lead to a dramatic decline in living standards. Probably would involve an adjustment. Things that are available to us now we would no longer have available to us. But I think that would be compensated and complemented by new forms of consumption, which is anyhow a feature we've already been regularly habituated to. Right? We are already habituated to constantly changing our consumption. 70% of the products we consume were not available to human beings 100 years ago. It's not that they're better quality, they were not available. So we're already actually, I think, quite habituated to changing our consumption patterns.
Do you want to take the question in the chat, Alex?
If my concern is about needing some form of pressure to encourage important production, what is your opinion on social welfare programs? Good question. As a pressure valve. Good question. So I think what's interesting about the UBI discussion and its relationship to welfare programs is the conventional welfare state was, I think, always understood as a kind of social contract. So it was a contract organized on a national scale in which, in exchange for certain work unconditional benefits, everyone who's born gets an education and some kind of healthcare. In the US, it's kind of more patchwork than in Europe. But on condition that the working class, and even maybe a guarantee of certain kind of working conditions and labor bargaining rights, that was a bundle of rights and entitlements that was negotiated at the national level in partnership with unions in exchange for the agreement to continue to be a working class that goes and does the work. So although on the individual level, it was understood that individuals enjoy these work unconditional entitlements, two things were always understood. One is that was never enough to just everyone leave work. And secondly, it was done in the broader climate of a post-war compromise in which labor unions themselves agreed to participate in the labor discipline of the working class itself, through administering contracts and engaging in negotiations and supporting the capitalist state. So although it's true that some welfare state entitlements are work unconditional, they're never fully adequate for everyone to leave work. And B, they emerge in the context of national agreements, in which it was assumed and understood part of that agreement that the production side will be guaranteed through organized labor and the working class. Voluntary participation in this state and that economy. And then behind it was the fact that many of these were still, in some ways or another, empires or declining empires that also were able to supplement their economies with goods produced outside them in economies where those workers weren't receiving those entitlements. That was the bit about the agreement that not honest. But that's why I think the argument about the UBI is different, and importantly different. It's emerged at the period of the crisis of the welfare state, in which that crisis has been in part then a failure to observe the sense in which production was guaranteed under a welfare state that the UBI hasn't. And so that's why I have a suspicion that the UBI is in truth more a handmaiden of the neoliberal period of converting welfare state into cash payments, incorporating people more heavily into markets, rather than decommodifying them, and emerges for that reason in the kind of crisis of the welfare state and the globalization of production. So
Yeah.
thank you for that question.
Marianne, and then you can ask.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was extremely interesting. My question would be more on the social aspect of it. So basically, since social injustice is kind of materialized in the economic realm, I would assume that most of or some of the defenders of the UBI would kind of put that argument forward to defend their system, although I'm not sure like how important that would be in their speech. But I'm really curious to know what a defender of the UBI would basically say about this like capitalistic narrative that has been developing in the past decades of, especially when it comes to gender dynamics, of basically women empowerment through like climbing the corporate ladder and the whole concept of shattering the glass ceiling. And I'm curious if they would think that it's very similar to the work ethic thing that, that would be just the capitalistic system exploiting and manipulating certain instincts and fights, or would they, like, what would be their opinion on that?
So let me see if I understand your question. So is it, what would a different group think about the UBI, which is the group that has been in general interested in and concerned with, is this specifically a feminist concern about, or no, or more broadly?
Broadly, and I guess also feminist movements, but I would be interested in knowing what they would think and what UBI defenders will reply to that.
Yeah, so one important strand for the intellectual defense of the UBI was, in fact, a certain kind of left-wing feminism. There was a famous movement called Wages for Housework that emerged in the early 70s. People like Selma James, Sylvia Federici, Maria Rosa Della Costa. I always get
Federici is in the documentary What is Democracy?
Federici is the most famous,
Yeah.
and they issued a series of pamphlets. I meant to bring it, actually. And what they argued was, look, housework is necessary labor, and yet we're not paid for it. In fact, we're made to enter these patriarchal marriages, have children, do the labor. We only survive through our economic and legal dependence on our husbands or fathers. And yet we all know that the labor we're doing is necessary, but because it's done domestically, it isn't done for a wage. So we think that we should get wages for it. We should have a payout. A state should give us money so that we can do that, because this labor is necessary. It has to be done, this reproductive labor. But it shouldn't be organized in a way that forces us into these relationships of domination and dependence. And that inspired many people to, and then there was an internal debate, because some people thought this was sort of too capitalist and concessive. And they argued better to think about organizing things like care cooperatives. But then where was the financing going to come for that? So should it be self-financed, or should the state finance care cooperatives? And should there be state entitlements to guarantees of childcare so that women aren't forced to stay at home? This is all seen as sort of conservative. Doesn't this just pay women to stay home and reproduce their domesticity, right? But in there was the idea, wait a second, the way that a capitalist society determines what counts as necessary labor is really screwed up. Because women who do labor that's obviously necessary don't get paid to do it. But if they leave their children at home and then go clean mansions, they are paid for doing it. So it looks like that's more necessary than what they do. Why should they have to go do that crap? Okay, so why not give them, and it seemed like this is a way, this opened a broader idea that, okay, so there's this radical argument for a UBI in that it is a way that leaves people free to do the work that they find valuable and meaningful. And it did in part come out of this. Now the problem is that the wages for housework argument developed at the very moment when mainstream feminism won its major victories and women massively entered the labor force. So it presupposed a situation in which a minority of women were in the formal labor market, majority of women were in fact confined to domestic life. And so the wages for housework looked like a majority appeal. But the opposite is true now. Right? It's been the dramatic increase in labor force participation by women. It's one of the most notable changes in the last 50 years, to the point where their labor force participation just prior to COVID was almost equal. Then COVID and the childcare duties and certain kind of inequality among men and women really reasserted itself. There's been a decline, whatever. Okay. But still way above the pre-70s. So and the reason that's a problem is now what happens is that wealthy women who have jobs, like their wealthy husbands, or if they're single, just pay poor women to do domestic labor and care for their kids. And so the implied shared interest, once women entered the labor market and a lot of patriarchal legal arrangements were eliminated, women could get credit cards, own their own property, no fault divorce, have access to contraception, glass ceiling, kind of stuff. Obviously not equal, but such a dramatic change. Now, actually, a higher percentage of women go to college in the United States than men. Astonishing change, right? So all across the board, which has then made that argument for UBI kind of lose its social foundation. And so instead, what you have left is the more radical socialist feminist argument, which tries to pick up on it and say, we're for a UBI insofar as we think capitalism screwed up and makes people do labor they shouldn't have to do. But there's still social reproduction labor that has to get done. And so we think a UBI would be a fair way of ensuring that that stuff gets done. And it falls back into the original puzzle, which is, still sounds a little bit like we're going to pay women to do domestic labor, social reproduction labor, which is why, for instance, in Europe, there's some states that have had very generous welfare states, but they're patriarchal welfare states. Very generous maternity leave policies and childcare laws, but all organized around the assumption the woman's going to stay home and care for the kid when it's born, right? So the alternative that's presented is the Swedish model, in which you have a massive cultural campaign to encourage men to take their paternity leave. So instead of basic income policies, what you get is very generous leave policies. And then a big, like you're waiting at the bus and there's a sign that says, "Dads, stay home." And it's just like a dad with a stroller. You know? We laugh, but like sometimes these things operate, since they operate through norms and expectations, the only solution is to change the norms and expectations. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
See, we have time. I don't know what time it is.
Yeah, I suggested yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So, two questions, one for you and one for the class. And then, so the question for you is, in your proposal of a shared labor, like socialist society, how do you erase people's like concept on like monetary exchange? Because people, if they do, you said like free labor,
Yeah.
but if they do something, how would you not expect them to like get something back?
Yeah. So why do we think that people would do things for its own sake, or at least for its non-monetary reward? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing I'd say is there's a huge number of things that we do, not for their monetary reward, but for their own sake. We do it sometimes for its intrinsic value. I am not caring for my children for the monetary reward I get, because I don't get a monetary reward. They're very expensive. And I don't care for my children because of the social recognition I get, because I don't get any social recognition for that unless I bring it up in class. And then I think people mostly find it amusing rather than give me any recognition. So that's an example. There's also, I mentioned most of you are more online than I am. There's a huge amount of stuff that people produce, a lot of content that people produce. They're doing it for the likes, mostly, but that's not a monetary reward. And I would imagine a shared labor social society to be one, in which people don't just do things for their own sake, just because it's good to do. Although I think a lot of people are more morally motivated, or like to imagine themselves morally motivated.
Right.
But they also do it because there would be a culture that would honor and respect and celebrate people who do it. Our 20th century experience of that is a chilling and dystopian version of that, where you had, like kind of Stakhanovite posters, like, where you ruthlessly exploit peasants who were like doing 12 hours of hard labor for the Soviet future, or like Maoist peasant farmers trying to fabricate steel in their barns. That is an awful dystopian version of it, but we can see why that was dystopian. but people are incredibly motivated by, I think, public opinion, and it's why I think a public culture would matter. Actually, and I think it would be a tremendous source of motivation. And I think one thing I like about public culture is its way of signaling norms to people. Right? It is a way of signaling norms. So even if at first people are only doing it for the likes, for the public respect and knowledge, that's also a way of drawing people's attention to what the norms are. And people then you come to think about, well, should I do it because it's the right thing to do? And also people, when something isn't unfair, I think people are generally more inclined to do it than when it is unfair. So if it isn't as burdensome, which I don't think it would be necessarily, and it's organized in a way where everyone can see that it has their interests in mind, then I think it's less implausible to think that people would be willing to do it despite the fact that you don't get a monetary reward.
Let's bundle the last set of questions. I saw Brittany. I think there was one. So let's
There was a woman in the red hair. I'd seen her.
Yeah, that's Brittany.
Oh, sorry. I don't know your name.
Hi.
And so we'll take all the last ones. Just raise your hand.
Yeah, so given that a lot of our labor is produced in prison, how is
Could you say again? I'm sorry.
given that a lot of labor is produced in prison, how
Yeah.
would the UBI argue for like its relationship with the prison industrial complex, and also your utopian socialist society argue for the relationship of the prison industrial complex?
Good question.
And
Your utopian socialist society seems to be predicated on the elimination of any form of kinship group other than all of humanity. We work for everyone. How would you get there and remove like religious kinship groups or family kinship groups where maybe I only want to work for my closer tribe than for everyone's benefit?
Good question too.
on.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I know there's been a lot of pilot programs and case studies on UBI. I'm just curious what we glean from those real-world examples of people trying to implement it.
I need to write down the question.
Yeah. So
I've
prison
got
industrial
kinship.
complex.
I've got prison labor, and then yours was
What did we learn from the real-world attempts to implement UBI?
experiments. Good. So maybe I should be clear. I'll just the way I wrote it. So kinship first. It's not predicated on the elimination of kinship groups. It's predicated on a realization of the true scope of the economy. So it isn't true that we just independently. Our society sometimes presents itself as like these self-sufficient units, the family, and supporting itself through its activity, and this family supporting itself through its activity. And that's a deception of our economy. It's not true. We support ourselves through on the national and global scale, which means there's already this form of quite extensive cooperation with people very different from us, but who we depend upon and need. But that dependence and need and the mechanisms for establishing it are concealed in quite wild and radical ways, unfairly distributed. So the thought is that there would be a different way of organizing that already existing deep interdependence. And that if we organize in a different way, we'd be more inclined to do our share. It's possible that that's not the case. It's possible that people, once it's made vivid to them, would become wildly nationalistic or parochial and want to, but then the interesting thing about that is if they really wanted to own, it would require them to then confront what it would mean to only produce for their kinship group. It would require true secession from society. The illusion is to imagine that you are only really dependent upon and serving and supporting your kinship group, when in fact you're not. So I think it would just make the real conditions of our existence clearer to us, to then make it clear to us what our attachments really are about. But it's not predicated on like the elimination of the family or anything like that. I don't think. It wouldn't necessitate that. And to the degree that it would realize what's already true about ours, right? I mean, we forget how much the self-sufficient family unit that we imagine has already been eradicated. That image comes from basically agrarian production, where the care and education and labor of the child primarily done in the household or perhaps in the local community within the one church in the town. But public education already is a massive departure in human history with the normal way of raising children. Right? It's already a massive erosion of the family in that sense anyway, which we sometimes lose because the words we have and the way we have talking is inherited from a very different social structure. Prison labor. Prison labor, I mean, I have a whole view about the relationship between socialism and incarceration, which, the short version is I think socialism's born with the critique of poverty and crime. And the origins of modern socialism are in fact in the view that people are not responsible, that society, that there are structural sources of crime, and that the socialist, as opposed to the liberal view of crime, is to eliminate the social sources of crime rather than incarcerate the criminals. That a socialist society would not be a society of mass incarceration by definition, because it would have eliminated most of both the social sources of crime and the social sources of the prison as an instrument of social control. I think the police and the prison are the two central instruments of a modern society, of a capitalist society, for discipline and controlling the capitalist class. The working class, not the capitalist class. They never go there, but almost never, right? Martha Stewart has to be arrested to make it look like the stock market's fair, but in general, that's. I know you're too young to know the reference, but look it up. You'll see what I mean. Yeah. Occasionally, you've got to arrest an insider trader to make it look like the stock market's fair. So, but generally, they get away with it. But as a small point of fact, it's not, sometimes statistics get passed around about prison labor and how much of the economy is based on prison labor. It's actually an extremely small fraction of the total labor that's performed to support this economy. The vast majority of it is free labor in the sense of wage labor people who may quit their jobs and go find another one and aren't constrained. So it is true that the prison labor done in prisons is wildly exploited and unfair, but it isn't necessary to the reproduction of a capitalist society. It's a more peculiar and horrible feature of our mass incarceration society that I think would quite rapidly disappear in the socialist. I happen to think the socialist society might still have a form of imprisonment for a specific and narrow class of crimes like murder, rape, and physical assault. I don't actually think those things would completely go away, but that's and then what one does about that. I'm, for that very narrow reason, not a prison abolitionist, though quite sympathetic to the thing. But that is unfortunately too off what I've already said to give any convincing explanation of why. But insofar as a shared labor society would, I think, eliminate most of the sources of many of the crimes, it would just not be a mass incarceration society, and you wouldn't have to worry about the prison labor question. I should say, though, if it's a society in which labor is not just a burden, but something that everybody does as part of their civic duty, then it would be prohibited from being something that's done in prison. Because the reason it's done in prison is to degrade labor, and to show labor to be something inherently degrading and wrong, and to cast a pall on it. And so it would be incompatible with a shared labor society in which doing your duty is something that a free person would do. It would be incompatible with that, and to make it part of punishment, because labor wouldn't be seen as punishment. It would be seen as part of a shared civic duty. So that's the more on-point account of why you wouldn't have it. It would be forced idleness, loss of liberty. That's it. And experiments. In my opinion, real-world experiments, which are generally these pretty local things that happen in a particular province or state, tell us very little about UBI as people imagine it on a national scale. Because the problem is you cannot generalize from a particular instance like this that presupposes all the background conditions. Cities and provinces, these are national and globally integrated economies with massive circulating massive circulation commodities in which huge amounts of what people consume aren't even produced in their own country. And so I think the general equilibrium effects is something. What would happen if you really generalized, universalized this income, made it actually universal, cannot be inferred from the empirical observations of small-scale studies. I think that's why one has to fall back on some more general, plausible social and economic theory. And I'm dubious about how useful those experiments are. That's why it's fine, it's cool, but I don't think that one can infer very much about them.
All right, on this note, lunch is here. Let's thank Alex for coming.
Thank you. Those were really fantastic questions. This was recorded, right?
Yes.
Good, so I can go back and trace the questions. Thank you.
All right. Help yourselves. See you on Friday. I'm sticking around a few minutes if you want to talk to me about anything course related.